How Eamon Met Kaidan, Chapter 11. Candlehearth Hall, Windhelm. Sundas, the 26th of Evening Star, in the 201st year of the 4th era. Kaidan. Kaidan kicked the snow off of his boots and stepped over the threshold into the smoky alehouse that served as an inn for travelers passing through Windhelm. The smell of wood smoke was overpowering, and his eyes began to water almost immediately. A scantily clad woman approached and put her hand on his arm, leaning in so that her breasts brushed provocatively over his torso. She said something near his ear, but he couldn't make out a word of it over the din in the crowded taproom. Whatever she was selling, he wasn't interested, so instead of asking the lass to repeat herself, he simply shook his head and stepped away from her to weave his way through the crowd toward the harried innkeeper. There were 2 Nords in front of him, paying for a meal and private rooms. The innkeeper was a middle-aged woman who looked pleasant enough until she opened her mouth. "I'm happy to rent you gentlemen a room, and you'll find no better accommodation in this city. But I think your elven friend might be more comfortable staying in the Grey Quarter with his own kind." Kaidan inhaled sharply but held his tongue. Gods, he hated Eastmarch. The man turned to his companion and projected his voice. "Do you hear that, Mitty? This woman doesn't want your uncle's coin. Looks like we'll be moving along to the Corner Club." "Now just wait a minute," the innkeeper said. "Your elf friend—" But the burly Nord interrupted her. "He's not my friend, madam. He's my family. And if you don't have room for him, then you don't have room for any of us." "Well, if it's that important to you," the sour woman began, but the Nord interrupted her again. "It is that important to me, make no mistake, and I'll not hear another word about it if you want my custom." The woman made no immediate objection, and the man plunked a heavy purse on the counter that made the woman's eyes glint with greed. "Good. I'm glad you see it my way," the man replied with an ironic tone that was lost on the lady. "We need 3 beds for the night, a hot meal for 3 exhausted men, and keep the ale coming." The woman made some placating reply and started blathering about the quality of their cheeses. "Eamon!" the man suddenly bellowed. Kaidan jerked at that name and followed the Nord's gaze as he turned and looked across the crowd. An Altmer male on the other side of the taproom held up a gloved hand and pointed to the stairs that led up to the dining rooms. "It's him. It has to be." Kaidan couldn't get a good look at the elf's face, but how many elves with that name could there be in Skyrim? He took a step to approach and confirm that this was the Eamon he was looking for, but just at that moment the Nords, these must be Eamon's cousins, finished their business and begged Kaidan's pardon to pass. Something in his chest contracted, and he stepped aside instead of introducing himself. Lowering his head, so as not to attract their notice, he turned to the innkeeper and paid for a room of his own. He knew he should speak up, but something held him back. She held him back. The moment he told these men who he was, this Eamon, if he was the right Eamon, would rush out of this inn and ride hell for leather back to Greywatch House, back to her, and this intense, precious bond between them would change. She would no longer be just his, and the world would no longer contain only the 2 of them. Kaidan would be on the outside, again. It would all be over. Before he'd even seen her face, Kaidan knew what Eamon meant to Amelia. She'd screamed his name over and over on that first night, and she'd called out for him in her sleep during all of the nights that followed. She'd spoken of almost nothing but Eamon on their journey from the prison to Windhelm, and her guilt over causing him worry had consumed their conversation during the carriage ride to Eamon's home. He knew it was selfish, and he knew it was wrong. He knew he should already be marching up those stairs to tell Eamon where Amelia was and put an end to her suffering. but he couldn't. Not yet. For the last 3 days, Kaidan had been the most important person in Amelia's life, and she had been the most important person in his. It wasn't lust, and it wasn't even romantic. It could be. It wasn't. He couldn't even think of her that way. Maybe not yet. No. It was something else. It was close, and it was sacred, and it was real. Kaidan hadn't ever experienced anything like that before. I just need to hold on to it for a little while longer. Before he could think better of it, the men were out of sight, and the moment had passed. No matter, they were clearly staying the night. He had time. He just needed a minute to work up to it. The racist innkeeper showed him to a private room. It was clean and inviting, with a fine wool blanket over the bed and what appeared to be a genuine feather pillow. He handed the woman his greatcoat and his boots to be dried and brushed. He flashed her that smile that worked on most of the ladies, and he gave her an extra coin to ensure that his belongings would be well cared for. After the door clicked shut behind her, he stripped down to the skin and draped his clothing over the back of a chair to dry out overnight. You've slept in that man's house. You've eaten his food. You've drunk his chocolate, for the God's sake. He caught sight of himself in the small looking glass over his wash basin and said aloud, "What are you doing, Kai?" After washing his face in the basin and tying his hair back, he felt almost human again. He dressed in dry clothing from his saddlebags and headed upstairs. He needed to eat something. He needed to sit down and rest, and he needed to find Eamon so he could do what needed to be done. The inn was overwarm, and the air was thick with soot from the fires, smoke from the tallow lamps, and the mixture of smells that human bodies make after being packed together too tightly for too long. As Kaidan ascended the stairwell, sounds of laughter and music and the low chatter of many overlapping conversations rose and muddled into a pleasant and almost intoxicating blanket. It was cooler up here, being so far from the kitchen fires below, and the exhaustion that Kaidan had delayed for so long began to sit down heavy on his shoulders. He needed to process all that had happened to him over the last 2 weeks. He needed to drink himself into oblivion and sleep for 3 days without dreaming. That would have to wait. He walked to the central fire pit and sank into a large wingback chair. It was ambrosia to his tired limbs and the gnawing ache in his right leg. The woman who had approached him earlier was standing near the wall, this time with a tray full of mugs. Not a flower girl, then, just a tavern girl. They shouldn't make her dress like that. It isn't safe. Kaidan lifted a hand to get her attention. She sauntered over with a practiced sway and asked, "Are you hungry, thirsty, or both?" He gave her a polite smile, but denied eye contact and said, "Thank you, I'd like an ale and a bowl of the house brown, miss." She transferred the tray to one hand and slid her free arm over the back of his chair to lean down and whisper, "I can satisfy your other appetites as well." Damn. He leaned forward to get distance from her face, which still hovered too close to his ear, and said, "Sorry, lass, but just the ale and the stew, if you please." She pouted, or pretended to pout at any rate, and said, "If you change your mind, I'm easy to find." He handed her a small stack of septums for her trouble and said firmly, "It's not going to happen, love." When the woman walked away, he looked around the room to locate Eamon and his Nord relatives. They were too far away, tucked in a corner on the other side of the great central fire. He could not hear anything they were saying or even clearly make out their faces. He decided he would need a reason to get up and change his seat. A lute player and a drummer were playing a lively jig, and Kaidan decided that was as good an excuse as any. He stood and joined the small group that had gathered around the musicians to clap and shout drunken encouragement as they performed. When the song ended, he took a seat better situated for his purpose. His back was to the men from this position, but they were very nearby. He heard the sound of the big Nord's rumbling voice and strained to listen in on their conversation. The young one asked his father if he was going to eat his baked potato. His father made it clear that yes, he was, thank you very much, and threatened bodily harm to his son if he didn't keep his eyes and his fingers on his own plate. The younger man chuckled, and then the trio stopped speaking. Aside from the scraping of spoons and the occasional clink of mugs on the table, there was nothing more to be heard. Kaidan startled when, all of a sudden, the object of his eavesdropping stepped around his chair and stood directly before him. The tall, elegant figure extended his hand and said simply, "Eamon Greywatch," before gesturing to the chair beside him. "May I sit?" Kaidan studied his face. He had the angular features of all the Altmer, but his eyes were a shocking shade of watery gray that reflected a metallic silver in the candlelight. He didn't look like the Thalmor guards. His movements and posture were informal and relaxed. His voice was warm, with an accent more Nord than Altmeri. Despite his elven features, there was nothing cold or haughty about Eamon Greywatch. There was only a look of profound weariness and a sadness that Kaidan understood far better than he had a right to. He took Eamon's hand and shook it. "Kaidan. Kaidan, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm only going to ask it once. Before I do, I'll explain who I am and why I'm asking so that you fully understand the situation." The elf then descended into the chair with that peculiar, liquid grace of the myrrh, and now that they were face to face, Kaidan could see the grinding set of Eamon's jaw, and he watched the mask of calm slide away from his face as a controlled fury took its place. For most of his life, Kaidan would have bristled at a challenge like this. He would have reveled in any excuse to give flight to reckless aggression. But that was all before. And this was her Eamon. "You and I have the misfortune of sharing a mutual enemy," Eamon said. "The Thalmor murdered my wife a little more than 2 years ago, and unless I am much mistaken, they recently secreted you off to an abandoned ruin here in Eastmarch, where you were brutally tortured." Kaidan's eyes widened in surprise. Eamon paused here and clearly expected some sort of response. Kaidan gave a curt nod, and Eamon continued. "You were held there alongside a young woman whose well-being I value above my own life. She is a Breton mage by the name of Amelia, but I strongly suspect you already know that." Kaidan nodded again. "Excellent. So now we've come to the point. I will do absolutely anything, and I chose that wording carefully, so do consider it, to make her safe again. And I will utterly destroy anything and anyone stupid enough to get in my way." Eamon opened his palm to reveal a sizzling ball of fire so hot that waves radiated from it, warping the air around them. And without looking up, he said, "So tell me, Kaidan, where is she?"